The broadcast is now starting.
Hello, everybody. Happy post-Thanksgiving. Hope you all are recovering nicely from your turkey coma that has been keeping all of us a little down. But hey, we're here to brighten up your spirits today with the next episode of the PixelMill Webinar Series and today's offering of the adventures of Azure Functions and Microsoft Graph. As usual, I am Michael Wells, the Partnerships and Community Manager here at PixelMill, and I am happy to have you guys here today. For those of you who are here for the first time, welcome. For those of you who are here again, welcome back. Happy to have all of you guys. As usual, at any time during the session, if you have any questions, please shoot them over to us. I'll be monitoring those, and I'll try to sneak them into Eric as we're going through. We will also have a 15-minute Q&A at the end of this session, so if we don't get to your questions in that moment, we will definitely get to them at the end. Without further ado, let me introduce you to our speaker today. We welcome him back. He's our original speaker for this series. He also happens to be our president and co-founder, Eric Overfield. Take it away, Eric.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Thank you all for joining us. Definitely excited to be back on this. It's been great having some guest presenters for us for our webinar series, but I'm happy to be back in saddle and be able to present some new stuff that I've been having fun with and playing with and looking forward to share. A couple of housekeeping things here. If you do want to download this slide deck, it is currently available. I have the address in the lower right-hand corner for you, as well as the demo. So I'm basically going through one larger demo in this session. If you want all of that code, you can definitely go get it. Another shout out to Jeremy Thake from Hyperfish was the impetus of this session idea, and he helped provide a lot of the code. So I definitely want to give him a big thanks for helping create the material here to help share, because it's some pretty fun, cool stuff. So with that, I say we just go ahead and get started here. So for those of you new to us, new to PixelMill, my name is Eric Overfield, president, co-founder of PixelMill. I'm a Microsoft regional director, a Microsoft MVP in the Office servers and services space. Written a couple books, and definitely love being a part of the SharePoint community. It is, I'm seeing it probably the highlight of my career overall is being able to be a part of this long-running community, and I hope it continues to last. Good ways to get a hold of me are always at my blog, ericoverfield.com, or pretty active on Twitter as well on industry and tech news and my thoughts of what's going on in the Office 365 collaboration and community space over at Eric Overfield. For those of you also new to PixelMill, who we are, we're a digital agency based out of Northern California. We focus on providing our clients with customized experiences on top of SharePoint, Office 365, and Azure to help them drive the adoption of the solutions that they need to make those platforms work best for them. So if you want to get started at all with us, please do contact us at pixelmill.com. You can find myself, give us a call, email us. We're definitely happy to talk to you. All right, so very simple agenda today, but it is going to take us some time, but it's also, if you think about at the end what's going to happen, there's some pretty cool stuff. We're looking at two primary technologies this morning. We're looking at Azure Functions, and we're going to be looking at the Microsoft Graph. But in particular, let's see what we can do to take these two really cool technologies and put them together. After I kind of give a brief overview of what Azure Functions are and sort of the idea behind them, we're going to go ahead and we're going to create an Azure function from scratch live here today. I'm going to take some code that has already been produced, but I think you're going to see some pretty powerful ideas behind how easy it is to work with something like Azure Functions. After that, we're going to quickly go over what Graph is, kind of a quick review of Graph. We're then going to go ahead and create what's called an Azure Active Directory application that will allow us to communicate with the Graph securely and correctly. We're going to connect that with our Azure function. And by the end of this hour, what we're intending to do is have a solution in place so that when an email message comes in, that email message is automatically processed. With that processing that's going to occur, it's going to go over to Azure's cognitive services and translate my email inline for me. We're going to build this from scratch. So if we can get this all done in an hour and it actually works, I hope you'll see like, wow, what would it have taken if I wanted to do this using more traditional web development techniques? Typically be more like days or more just to spin everything up. And the code itself is pretty simple and clean as well. So this is a 200 level session. We are going to look at a little bit of code, but I'm not really going to go into great detail. So we're going to try to stay higher level of more what's possible, and we'll go from there. So first of all, Azure Functions. Azure Functions themselves are based on the architectural style called Serverless Architecture. Now, there's a couple different ways of looking at serverless architecture, but the one that I think is of interest, especially with Azure Functions, is this concept of building custom code that's running in a container, some sort of inferior container. You're running custom code where you don't have to worry about all of the back-end hardware infrastructure, software infrastructure, et cetera, where you're able to basically get some sort of function as a service. So it's a new technology, newer technology, I suppose, newer idea that's really gaining steam. There's another way of doing this with something called Docker that many of you have heard of that also provides some of this sort of serverless architecture and more in a local space, more in your development space traditionally. But we're going to be looking at this kind of idea as a function as a service. So serverless itself, what we're trying to mean there is this idea of an abstraction of the actual underlying infrastructure and servers. So I'm talking about abstraction of all of the hardware infrastructure, abstraction of the operating system infrastructure, and where you don't have to even worry about what's going on behind the scenes. You don't have to update your hard drive, maintain it. If a hard drive goes down, you don't care. Doesn't matter. You'll never even see it. If the operating system needs to get updated or patched, or there's some security flaw in the underlying architecture and infrastructure, you don't care. You get this container that you're able to put your custom code in, and it just works. All of that backend stuff is done for you. You don't have to worry about how to get all the compilers necessarily in place. You don't have to worry about how you're going to get different things to work. That's all done. The infrastructure piece is handled for you. But this is also driven on this idea of event-driven scaling. So the ideal serverless state is something that can scale for you. So that is, if you start having only one request every hour, 3 requests a day during development, but you want that to scale out to 10,000 requests a second. The idea of serverless, what serverless looks to offer is that scale for you almost instantaneous, that the backend infrastructure will scale itself out for you as necessary to run any amount of requests that you may have. Now, there's a few little kind of hiccups with that, in my opinion. We're going to see that when we first spin up our Azure function and we try to get it all kind of working, there might be some delays where there's some little timeouts. That's because you're in serverless, you don't actually have a always-on server in a sense. The first time it spins up, it may take a couple extra seconds and there may be a complaint. But if you have an Azure function or you have serverless that is a function that's being used continually, it's going to be kind of kept in memory for you and you won't have to worry about that timeout. So there are a few little hiccups to think about, but still we'll deal with it. Serverless, though, again, it's giving you high availability, which I think is truly important. And ideally serverless, in particular with Azure Functions, we are only going to get billed for the actual processing that we do. So we don't have to pay for extra power to have our server on at all times. We don't have to pay for CPU cycles or memory cycles or memory storage that isn't actually being used because at this moment, our particular process isn't actually running. So we can get sub-second billing where we are billed only for the processing time that we may need, which can save us a fortune on cost for sure. How this whole idea is different, there's a couple ways to look at it for sure, but it's definitely worth thinking about. Traditionally, applications would have been built, and I've been building these kind of things since the 90s, and we built like these large monolithic applications. We'd build this large code base that would all have to go into typically, let's say, like a Windows server, some sort of Microsoft OS. We'd have to spin all that up. We'd have all this compiled code, and we would go ahead and we would deploy it, and it would work. But the idea of serverless is instead we build specific components that we need that are only loosely coupled. And so we have specific processes that could run, and they're in their own little container, they're in their own little Azure function, and we can go trigger that as needed, and we only have to worry about being billed, in particular, being charged for that when that one little microprocess might in fact run. Now, within the clients itself, typically we'd have a lot of processing that would occur potentially in the application that we're building or the client application that we might be building. But with serverless, we could be offloading a lot of that processing in an asynchronous or even synchronous way out to another service, i.e. our Azure function, out to our serverless architecture. So a lot of the processing that we used to maybe embed directly into an app can now be handled by these external microservices or microprocesses. Now, a part of like this idea, this monolithic application, we often would build these really complex frameworks that all might have been deployed as one large DLL or one large sort of compiled code component, or maybe a few heavily coupled components that had to work together. But with serverless, the idea here is that we'd be building micro functionality where we would build little microservices that would handle specific jobs. And within those specific jobs, we could then call them as needed, and they would only be executed and would only use resourcing as those specific micro jobs, micro functional components were actually called. There are quite a few benefits that we are seeing with serverless, and definitely in the Office 365 space and SharePoint Online space, serverless and Azure Functions are just providing us the go-to solutions for issues such as not able to have full trust solutions in SharePoint Online. But serverless in general provides some universal benefits, such as you're able to ship your end product quicker. You're able to, because you don't have to focus on infrastructure. You don't have to focus on kind of the back-end DevOps where you just have to spin up bare metal and you got to get everything running. You got to have everything in a way that can scale somehow, that has backup built in, that has all these extra components. You don't have to worry about any of that. So you can get to market quicker. You can build solutions for your organization quicker and drive that business value. And since your DevOps doesn't have to worry about infrastructure maintenance and whatnot, that allows all of us to focus on the business logic, which it's just, to me, it comes down to getting your code out quicker, saving a lot of money when you actually are running your code, and you can focus on the end solution itself. So I think what could be helpful is to let's look at some examples. Let's think us through some ideas of how serverless can help, and then we'll go ahead and we'll spin up a Azure function, and you'll see live how you would do this, how you would actually spin up an Azure function in Azure. So let's say you wanted something that was timer based, where every 15 minutes you wanted to have something happen, and you might then trigger an Azure function that would say, okay, go look at my database, go look at a table, and go find it and delete any kind of invalid data. You might have some business logic that can help ensure some governance rules on what is considered valid data within your database or within a table. And at the end of this, every 15 minutes, you know that in a delta of 15 minutes or less, you've got a nice clean table. Now think about how you would do this on a if you had to maintain the whole infrastructure. I mean, you could definitely create a scheduler, but you'd have to build an application. You'd have to build it Visual Studio. You'd have to compile it, make sure it all works, of course, and you'd have to maintain that whole infrastructure. Well, with serverless, you can focus on just the actual little piece of business logic that you know can get executed every X amount of X time to go and just focus on keeping that table clean. We can also have things that are event-based. So let's say that we want to have a subscription on when a file is added to blob storage. Say someone is uploading a CVS file, or we have a process that uploads something automatically into blob storage. An Azure function or a serverless idea, this Azure function could get triggered that could say, okay, so I've got the CVS file, it's valid, it could validate it, it could do whatever it needs to do, but then it could take that data and it can put it into maybe some sort of data row, which could then be used to drive some Power BI so that you can actually get valid data, valid insights into the data that you've uploaded. And all you've had to worry about is an Azure function building this little piece of code that can handle that CSV file and dump the data into some sort of data table. You don't have to worry about how the blob storage works. You don't have to worry about all the infrastructure. And on the Power BI, you can just have it link into that table. So you can do so much power here without having to worry about anything other than your business logic itself. Maybe have some sort of software as a service event processing, such as I upload an Excel document into my OneDrive or something. Again, it's very similar as the other example. An Azure function could say, okay, well, let's go ahead and let's analyze that content using Microsoft Graph. And we can create some new sheets. We can create new data based on that. And again, you're going to hear me say this, we can get you just focus on the business logic. We don't have to worry about how data is going to get moved anywhere. We can just say, hey, I want to subscribe to when a file is saved in my OneDrive. Go ahead and run my microprocessor, my micro functionality to handle that. And you can let all the other tools do all the other magic for you. We can go like a step further. Let's think if we had some sort of a larger web application. And so we might have a large website or something. And a part of that, we might want to be able to have some sort of ad. And of course, all of us have used the internet and we're always seeing those Google ads. And they use something very similar to this idea. Whereas when a web page is loaded, instead of like trying to figure out everything out that web page might need, the web page loads. And at that point, the web page is telling the browser via JavaScript or something, hey, go ahead and call this webhook. So that webhook could be an Azure function that says, oh, based on who you are and based on your user profile, I'm going to go ahead and create an ad. And that Azure function could then send that data back to the completed page. Now let's take some of the differences that we saw before. Like in classic architecture, we might have to figure out all this, what's the right ad to display to somebody before the page actually got compiled and delivered to the browser. And you'd create this very large application. And if you wanted to update that one little piece of code for the ad base, for creating these ads, you may have to redeploy your whole code, which could be really painful and definitely not necessarily fun. But using something like Azure Functions, you can have these little microprocesses. And if you wanted to change how, say, an ad worked, you could just update and work on that specific piece of code, and it would not touch anything else. It would just work on that one little piece. Got a few more for us. I think some other cool ideas. Let's say we have an application where maybe like a mobile phone or something, and you take a photo, and you want your application to then say, I've got this photo. Great. Go ahead and call this webhook. That webhook through an Azure function that application may send that image over to Azure Function. The Azure Function could say, okay, cool. I'm going to store this in blob storage, and I'm going to go ahead and automatically call another Azure Function, which would go and create the scaled images of this and save those for the application. So instead of making the client application do all of this work, and maybe to create all these scaled images, it can offload all that functionality to a backend service, these Azure Functions. And say you wanted to update how the images were scaled, let's say, you wouldn't have to go back to the application and redevelop and redeploy it to all 10,000 customers. You could just update the Azure Function one space, and now everyone's going to automatically use that updated code. And got two more, I think. Let's look at some real-time stream processing. So you've got all these devices that might be sending in data into Azure Stream Analytics. And so all this data is coming in, and that might then that could trigger your Azure function, trigger these serverless micro functionalities. And your little code can then maybe transform that data and make it more structured, because it kind of came in very unstructured. You can translate this to structured data and then automatically maybe send that into SQL Online, so it could be further processed. Kind of a last idea here that I have, something like, let's look at bots. Bots are becoming very popular. They're definitely being included into, we're seeing them in SharePoint portals for sure. We're seeing them in Teams. This idea that you can kind of chat with a bot to have it do things for you. Maybe you want to create a new site, or maybe you need help with something. You can type into Teams and say, hey, I'd like to do this. Well, the bot itself, you can make it be basically simple. The bot itself can be just a simple interface that when a message comes in, to that bot, the bot's going to go ahead and call an Azure function and say, hey, go process this message for me. And maybe you might have something like Cortana Analytics that your Azure function connects to help you answer that question. It will then create a response, sends it back to the bot, and the bot's able to then reply to somebody. But your bot itself is a very simple thing. It just is a message processor. Your functionality could be just done all within a little Azure function. And all of these scenarios I talked about, all you were focusing on was the business logic. You were focusing on the application itself. You did not have to worry about how are you going to build this infrastructure to be able to respond to a request, be able to do something based on a request. So based on that, let's go ahead and do this. Like, let's create an Azure function. Let's see how we can do it and how quick it is for me to put custom code into an application and get a response. And when I'm doing this, like, think through, how would I have done this using classic infrastructure and architecture? We're talking a day or two, or minimum. You create all the hardware, even with VMs, you'd have to set up the operating system, patch it, set up your web server, set up some sort of request response process, etc. We're going to do this so much simpler. Okay, so what I want to do here is I'm going to go ahead and load up my Azure dashboard. So I'm assuming that you already have access to Azure. I mean, Azure is so much. We're looking at one small, very little piece of it, but it's still a pretty cool piece. So I do have to sort of have some assumptions here. So once you have Azure spun up, you might want to create a Azure function. A lot of ways to do that. I've already pinned Azure or function apps to my little navigation on the left, but you could always just go to new, and if you typed in functions as a search, you should get function app. If you don't, you could actually just run a search, and Azure's smart enough to know that really function, you're probably going to want a function app, so you can go ahead and say, I would like to create a new function app or an Azure function. What you need to do is you need to provide a name to your Azure function. So we're going to, and it needs to be unique, but it can be kind of whatever you want it to be. Now, for simplicity's sakes, I'm just going to use a function name that I already kind of have set up here, but I do need to call it number 3 because it's the third one. You're going to need to tell it how, basically where you want it stored and how you want to be billed. I've got a subscription already set up for it. I've got a hosting plan already set up, and where do I want storage? And I'm actually going to use some existing storage because it's just a little easier for me. But again, 200 level, don't really want to go into heavy details of all these different options, but you can learn all about them. But I'm going to go ahead and create my Azure function. Basically, I had to give it a name. I had to tell it how I want to get billed, and it's off to the races. So the Azure function itself is being created right now. Now, normally I'd kind of go on and do something else while this is happening, but I have found this process is so quick, it's really not worth going into too much. Hopefully, though, it will be done. There we go, already been created, perfect. So now if we go to function apps, we should see our new function, our Azure function, which is demo Azure function graph 3. Perfect, so this was just created. If I go ahead and I select this, and I get into it, it will eventually load for me. It's got this little animation here telling me that it's loading. The Azure function itself, at this point, it's just a container. I've created a container that says, hey, I'm going to want to create some sort of Azure functions here. And I can go ahead and say, great, I'd like to now add a function. I want to create something that can go do something. Now, I have lots of different ways to do this. I could follow their pre-made function. Nah, I don't want to do that. I'm going to go ahead and start from, whoops, I don't want to start from source control. Let me go back and do that. I'm going to create a custom function. Now, when I create a custom function, I get lots of options. What's really cool about Azure Functions is that you can build them in lots of different languages that you may want, and they can be set up to do different things. They can be triggered different ways. They can be based on like timer jobs that are going to happen. But I actually want to build a generic webhook, and the generic webhook that I'm going to load is going to be JavaScript. So I want a webhook. I want an API that I can call, or a HTTP endpoint I can call, basically as a webhook. I want it to take in a request, and then I want it to respond. And I want to build my application in JavaScript. I don't want to use C# or anything like that. I just want to use JavaScript. So I can go ahead and say good to go and create. And I now have a function here in a second. Perfect. I do. Now, in order to call an Azure function, you're going to need a URL. You need to be able to call it via a web page. So within the Azure function itself that I've created, I'm able to click on Get Function URL, and I can now get the URL that I would call in order to actually execute this code. Now, this code that you see here, this JavaScript that you see here, is not running on the client side. Although it's a JavaScript, this code is actually going to be running on the server side. The server is going to run it, and it's going to then do something. And in this case, it's going to actually create some sort of context response, and it's going to have a response to send back to whoever called this function. Now, this URL, I actually need this URL because later on I'm going to end up calling this function somehow, right? So I'm going to go ahead and just record that URL so I have it at a later date. Okay, so now this is really cool. If you want to like see this thing in action, you can do this. You can just go ahead and say, I would like to run this. So in run, look on the right-hand side. It ran the function, and I already have a response. Within 3 minutes, 5 minutes here, I was able to create basically a web server, if you think about it. I have an endpoint, and I was able to, even in the browser, work on my code, and then I was able to test my code and say, hey, based on specific input, go ahead and reply with some sort of output. I mean, that's like, I just saved 8 hours right there because I already have a web server that already can just reply to a request. Pretty darn cool. There are some other little changes that I'm going to make here before I move forward. So one of the things I want to do is I want to replace this code with some new code. I'll look at this code in a second. I just need to get it here spun up. When we go into the graph, we'll look at sort of what's going on here. But I'm just copying and pasted over some code. Now, for those of you who have worked with JavaScript, this is more modern JavaScript. I'll just leave it at that. And one of the things it needs to do is it's requiring some additional components. Well, for those of you who've worked with Node before, these would be packages. This is code somewhere that has to come from something, and I need to include this code. But I've abstracted the web server, right? So where am I supposed to go and add in extra controls, extra code, extra modules that my Azure function might need? No worries. We've got you covered on all that. So if we go back to the Azure function itself and we go to the platform features, within platform features, what you're going to find here is there's an advanced tool called Kudu. Kudu itself is so cool. It allows me to have access into the web server that my Azure function is running in. So if I go to debug console and I go to command, I'm going to see two things. I'm going to see a command shell. I'm now able to interact, in a sense, with my containerized web server. Wow. Okay. But I need to add some files. So if I drill on into I don't know if you noticed that, I was in the www root folder. Doesn't that sound familiar? Maybe IISE, yep. Okay, and I can see my generic webhook.js webhook that I created. And within it, I can see two files, and one of them is index.js. So if I go ahead and I edit this, get all in the browser, this is the exact same code I just copied and pasted. So I can edit my web server. I have access into my web server. Well, I need to include in here a couple of extra JavaScript files. And I also want to use Node. I want to be able to install some Node packages. And I can do that. So I have some files that I need to move over, some extra JavaScript. I'm going to drag and drop them. This is so cool. And in the browser, it automatically got added. Very cool. Okay, well, I actually need to do npm install because I have a package.json file, and I need to go and have Node go ahead and install a whole bunch of extra packages for me. All in the browser, I can go ahead and say, hey, npm install, go do that. Now, this is going to take a little bit of time to respond, so I'm going to kind of move on to do some other things first. All right, let's go back to my function. Now, the function itself.
Hey, Eric, real quick, we had a good question come in, and I want to get to it before you move just too far away from it. Can you use VBA to create a serverless function?
What were the letters you used?
V as in Victor,
Yeah.
B as in boy, A as in apple.
The recommended approach, I would say, is VB itself. I've always used just C# and JavaScript and PowerShell. I would think so, but I do not know. I can find out for you for sure, or someone else on this call may have already worked with Azure Functions to give us that answer, so we'll look. Traditionally, though, well, not traditionally. Another thing that I'm not going into is you can use Visual Studio to do a lot of the work as well. So I'm pretty sure you can use VB as well as a language. I think that's what the question is.
Yeah, he was referring to Visual Basic.
Yeah, exactly. I'm pretty sure.
Gotcha.
I haven't tried. I mean, I'm pretty sure I've seen it before, but I always ignore it because I know I saw F# is always on the list as well. Yeah. Okay.
Cool. Thank you.
When a webhook is called, or when my Azure function is being called as a webhook, the Azure function is going to be expecting certain kind of data. It's going to expect a certain sort of input. And that's based on this idea of a webhook. So there's a mode that says, hey, look, my Azure function is automatically going to be expecting input in a certain way. It's going to expect my request data in a certain way. Now, for this particular demo, I'm saying no, I actually don't care about that. Just although you're a webhook, just accept the data as is, or just give me the data. I don't want you to try to pre-process it as a webhook. I'm going to handle that for me. So it's one little change I need to make with my Azure function, but we're able to do that. And also, if you think about it, it's kind of cool. Our Azure function can be smart enough to do some pre-processing for us to make our webhook a little easier to use. Okay, so I've built a webhook. I've built an Azure function. I've said it's a webhook that's going to be running, that's going to use JavaScript as its backend language. I had to set the integrate mode to standard so that basically the input that comes in, I just can use it. I can just work with it. I was even able to go into the web server in itself, in a sense, and I was able to add in additional JavaScript files that I might need, and I was able to say, hey, Node, go ahead and install a bunch of extra packages you may need. And we can see this is already working. A Node modules folder was automatically created for me. This hasn't finished yet, so it's gonna keep going. I'm gonna go ahead and move on because I want to be able to get to the graph stuff, because we're gonna see some really cool stuff happen here in just a little bit. So Microsoft Graph, I would assume most of you have heard of it, worked with it. So for those of you new to it, or just maybe as a review and as a recap, Microsoft Graph is Microsoft's more unified solution around Office 365, helping you to work with your data and also, more importantly, find relationships and insights into the data that you find. The Graph provides a Graph API endpoint, which is really cool because it's a unified, supposed to become, and it's working on it, a unified endpoint to get basically to all of your data within Office 365. You can do things like access data such as me, like who I am. You can access user information. You can access all the different groups that might have been created. You can use the Graph to get to your own OneDrive so that you can go get to all of your files. You can then drill into data, like you could actually say, hey, based on this specific item that was found, I want more information about it. I want to retrieve information. You're able to get insights into, say, things like what's trending. So often this is used for like what's trending for me. And as you're building applications for your end users, you'll be having, in a sense, them connect to the Graph in their context so that they can get back their insights, and that could then be presented on a page, or it could be presented in some sort of application. And the Graph is able to work ideally with organizational accounts as well as personal accounts. You can learn all about this over at graph.microsoft.com. It is a lot. There's a lot there, which is really cool, and they're continually improving it and making it really making it a lot better. Now Microsoft has provided a unified API for us to be able to interact with this data, the single endpoint. And I'm just providing kind of some general thoughts here, some common use cases that I've seen my clients use. There are two primary endpoints, though, shall we say. There's the V1. As well as beta. So there's an endpoint such as graph.microsoft.com/v1.0, and you can go ahead and access anything that's fully ready and available in public release, general availability, excuse me. But there's also beta endpoints as well. These are endpoints that are subject to change, but they might be giving you some of the tools that you need or the data that you need. And you just change the version from v1.0 to beta. But you can get your profile, your files, your photo, who your manager might be, users in your organization, and then using beta, you can get things like my tasks and my OneNotes, which are pretty cool and very useful. So let's go ahead and work with the Graph so that we can now do something. We can now interact with content available to us within our Office 365 tenant. And again, we're going to be using Graph to make that interaction occur. There is a URL I provided at the top of the beginning of the hour on this whole demo. So all the code that I'm going over can all be found at this address, as well as within that code, there's a link to, it was Jeremy Thake's blog post that originally had kind of the idea around this. So again, I want to give him a huge shout out. He definitely helped make this happen for me. Okay. So let's go ahead and let's move on and see where we're at. So what I'm waiting for here, perfect. Okay, so my Azure function has set up. We can now see in the console that Node has barfed out all of its response and saying, hey, here's all the stuff that I installed. So at this point, our Azure function is actually ready to go. We just need to do the next piece. The next piece is we need to connect to the Graph. The Graph itself is very secure and pretty powerful, but we need to be able to securely interact with it, and we need to interact with it with some sort of context. Well, our Azure function is running on its own over there somewhere, and it doesn't have any context. It needs to have a way to validate itself to say, hey, I would like to use the Graph, and you can trust me because not just because I'm saying so, but because I have certain credentials that you, Graph, agree upon. And the way that is done is through Azure Active Directory applications, excuse me. So what we need to do to interact with the Graph, because the Graph is there, it's just there. We need to interact with it, and we do that by going to Azure Active Directory. That's already been saved, so I'm okay with that. And within Azure Active Directory, we can go to app registrations. So within apps registrations, we can go ahead and say, hey, we would like to spin up a new application. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just copy this name here because I'm going to create, oops, let me copy this name here. I'm going to create a new one for us. And you'll see I'm not doing smoke and mirrors here. This is all working. So I'm going to change this to Demo Azure Functions Graph API 3. I need to give an application type. I'm just going to go with an API because I want to be able to interact with my my application here from an application scope. I do need to provide a sign-on URL, even though I'm not using it. So oftentimes in applications, you would have someone go to a sign-on URL to go authenticate with Graph so that they can do it. We don't need that because we're doing this in the context of an application itself. There is no real login that's going to occur from a client side. But we do need a sign-on URL. This could actually be anything you want as long as it's really unique. It could just be anything. In the interest of time and whatnot, I have a sign-on URL here. I'm just going to copy and paste this, and I'm going to add a 3 at the end. So it's just a URL that's provided. It doesn't have to be active or anything. You just need to provide a value in this specific case. Perfect. Okay, that got created nice and quick. I can now click on that application, and I need to do a few things here. First thing I want to do is I want to tell this application, hey, you can go talk to Graph. So I'm going to click on Required Permissions. Within required permissions, I don't need to click on that. I need to add a new permission. I'm going to select a new API. That API is going to be Graph, and I'm going to select it. Perfect. So now I have access to Graph. Perfect. I like it. I now need to tell this application, hey, these are the aspects of Graph that I want to have access to, because as of now, it doesn't have access to anything, this is a really good thing, by the way. The fact that when you create a registration that can use Graph, it doesn't have access to everything. So you can have multiple applications, Azure Active Directory applications, that each has their own restricted application. So if there was some sort of hack that could occur, your application would still be limited to just what you gave it access to. So you don't want to say, hey, okay, you have access to everything. Very, very bad idea. You just want to say you have access to these few things. So I'm going to go ahead and say like, maybe my app wants to be able to read and write calendars in all mailboxes. Maybe I need to read all users' profiles. And let's go ahead, and there's one more. I need to be able to read and write, not contacts. I need to be able to, and I always have problems finding these things. I want to read and write mail in all mailboxes. In particular, this is the one I care about because I actually don't need profiles. I think I just need directory data. And I always get these wrong. So yeah, directory data, calendars, mail. In particular, what I want to say is when an email message comes in, I want to somehow be notified. I'll figure that out in a little bit. But I need to be able to get that email message. My Azure function needs to be able to get it. So I need my app to allow me to get email, and then I want to be able to write to email as well. I want to be able to change the email message to do something. So I'm going to go ahead and click on Select, and done. And if this all goes well, perfect, we see that I now have permissions and I have 3. Okay, so now that I've got an application that can interact with Graph, so I have some sort of thing that I can do to interact with Graph, I now need a way to authenticate with this Graph client. With this application, AAD application. And the way we do that, the way we're going to do it here is not really by, quote, logging somebody in by asking for your username and password, because our application doesn't have that. Instead, what we're going to say is, well, we want a key. We want some sort of secure key that we can create that we can say, hey, based on this key that no one should have, like a secret, go ahead and I am me. I'm you trust me because I've got the key, the secret key, the secret handshake that only people who you've allowed have it. So to do that, I click on key. I can go ahead and add a new key. So I can just say key 1. I can give it a duration. The description really isn't important. I can say, well, it never expires. And what happens is when you save this, you get a value right here. Whoops. Which is the secret key. Now, as soon as I click away from it, it's going to disappear. And some of you, you security hawks, and there's a few of you on this call, should be saying, oh, I can go in and break this. Yeah, you could. You could probably mess with me, but I'm going to delete this key after we're done. And to me, doesn't matter too much. So yeah, I understand. So normally this would be a bad idea, but you never should allow anybody to see any of this stuff, but I really don't care. Okay, so I have a key. So the last thing I'm going to need is I need to be able to say that this is the application I want to interact with. And we do that with this application ID right here. So I'm going to record that as well. So with my my application ID with my secret, I can now speak to this Azure Active Directory registration that has specific access to Graph. Okay, cool. And what that access is it can interact with email in particular. It can interact with my mailbox. Excellent. I like this. Okay. One last thing I do need to get from this is my app registrations. I need to have my app be able to know how to go get a token to interact with Graph. So using all those permissions, what you get out of it at the end when you're talking to Graph is you get a token. And the token I need here, there's a lot going on here, again, 200 level. I need my auth 2.0 token endpoint so that my application knows how to go and get a token to be able to interact with my application so that it can interact with the Graph. Okay, cool. All right, I have an application that I can now speak to so that I can work with the Graph. One last thing I do want to do here before I go back into my code is I want to speak to Azure Cognitive Services. Okay, cool. So let's go to more services. Let's type in cognitive. Perfect, cognitive services. I didn't have to do anything special to set up cognitive services. It was available to me. Now we can see I already have a cognitive service available to me. We're actually going to use that, and I'll show you why here, but I'm going to add a new cognitive service, and I want to use the translate. Translate. Did I spell that wrong? Let's try text. There we go. The translator text API. And I'm going to use the translator text API, not the speech. And I'm going to go ahead and create that. And when I create it, one of the things it's going to ask me for is my pricing. And their cognitive services have a free tier if there's only X amount of requests per day or per whatnot. You'll only have one of those. And so I only want one, so I've already created it. So this is all I had to do was to create that the text translator API was to say I'd like to use it, and I selected the free pricing tier, and I clicked create, and it worked for me. Really, really simple here. So let's go ahead and go back to the cognitive service API that I have, and what I care about is under keys. There is a key that I needed to be able to talk to the translator API. So the translator API kind of has its own, cognitive API has its own settings and its own ways to interact with it, but I need a key to be able to securely interact with it. So I'm taking that key and I've actually already saved it here. So based on the 5 pieces of information that I've currently provided, that I've currently recorded here, I can now start to interact with Graph API securely and safely. And I can now finish the configuration of my Azure function. I told you this is going to be one big demo, but at a 200 level, and considering this is recorded and the fact that all of my code is available with full instructions, I think you can get a lot out of this here. So let's go back to my Azure function, and let's look at what's going on here in my Azure function. I can go into the code, and within the code itself, this is it. This is really all the code that I've created. There are a couple other modules that I talked about that I pushed in that were that you can work on, that you can look at. But what's happening here is this code, this webhook is based on the idea of a subscription. So you can subscribe to events in Graph. So you can say, hey, when an event occurs in Office 365, tell me about it, and you tell it to me via a webhook, via a URL endpoint. So what happens when you create a subscription is that the subscription service sends you a validation token, and it expects you to reply with that validation token within 10 seconds. So the first piece of my code is basically allowing us to set up a subscription. And it's really simple. When this first happens, by the way, it's most likely going to fail, and that's okay. And we'll look at that in a little bit. It's because, again, the subscription service expects that 10-second reply. And oftentimes, my first time I spin up an Azure function, it'll take more than 10 seconds to occur. Okay, so any other time this thing is triggered, anytime my Azure functions are triggered, there should be a body value that comes in. There should be a whole message within the body. Within that message, what I want to do is I'm going to go connect to the Graph. And I've got I need to get an access token. Based on that, I can now connect to the Graph, and I can say, hey, I would like to go and get the email message that that triggered the subscription, that triggered the message. Based on getting that email message, I can go ahead and I can grab the content of that email message. I can go ahead and translate something such as the subject. Based on the translated subject, I want to go ahead and update the email message so that I have a new translated subject. Pretty clean code. Once you kind of work through all of it, that's really it. I'm using a couple packages to help me get the subject of an email message securely and safely through the graph, and then update it based on the Cognitive Services API. Wow, so impressive when I saw this work. Okay, so now that we have that at the top, I need to somehow provide the client ID, the secret that I need to talk to Graph, the translator secret so I can work with my translator, etc. Well, you'll see here that I have this thing process.environment, maybe like application environment variables. Well, wouldn't that be cool, right? That's how we traditionally have stored things that our code may need, is through application variables. No problem. Azure Functions provide that to us. If we go back to Azure Functions, the Azure function in particular, we're going to see that there's an application setting field. And if we click on that and we scroll on down, we'll see that there are, in fact, application settings that we can set up and that any of our Azure functions that we create can now use. Wow, cool. Okay, so let me go ahead and I need to add some application settings here. So I'm going to go ahead and quickly create the 4 that I need. And again, I know what the 4 are based on my code, which I'll show you here once I've created them again, but I just need to get these values in so that they are available. And you all saw me copy and paste all of these here directly from the code that I provided. So this is not using an existing project. The only thing existing here is the translator code that I created. The translator, Cognitive Services Translator API. That yes, I'm reusing that, but that I just set up. I didn't have to like configure it. It just works. Okay, and again, where I am using these and where I know how to get these string values here was if I go into my code, we'll see exactly how I'm calling those code, how I'm calling those keys. If my Azure function will load for me eventually. Slowly. There we go. That's the same 4 keys that I've got here. Perfect. Okay. So I have an Azure function. I have all my tokens set up, and I have got and I've even got my Azure Active Directory application configured. Now, I need to consent to the permissions for my Azure Active Directory registration. You only have to do this once. I'm not overly thrilled that you have to do this, just to be direct, but it is something you need to do. This is well documented by Microsoft, but basically you need to load a specific URL, and within that URL, you need to give it the client ID of the Azure Active Directory application that you want to consent to. You basically need to log in and say, hey, I actually have the permissions to do this, and yes, I am okay with this Azure Active Directory having the rights to that specific, to those specific endpoints within whatever it might be, such as Graph. So here I need the client ID, which I know that I removed. So it's this client ID right here. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to replace the client ID with the client ID I just provided. I need to tell it the resource I'm going to want to use, which is Graph, and I need to give it the redirect URL. That redirect URL is not really important. Again, that is actually going to error out for us. It's going to say after we've consented to the AAD application, it's going to say, oh, that URL doesn't exist. Yeah, that's totally fine. So I'm just going to go ahead and load that up. I need to sign in. And once I sign in, it says, hey, are you sure you want to do all this? And this is the exact same list that we created in our application. If you remember when I created the application, I had to give it permissions. Those are the exact permissions that I said yes to. So when I clicked accept, this is going to give me consent, and it's going to say, yep, we're good to go, but it's saying, oh, that URL didn't exist. It's over at the bottom. Totally fine. We can ignore it. We never have to do that again. We're good to go. We can move on. Perfect. All of our backend stuff is set up. It's just sitting there waiting to be used. Now we need to go ahead and tell Graph we would like to subscribe to when that event occurs, whatever that event may be. Easiest way I can show that is using what's called the Graph Explorer. Very easy to find. Just Google Graph Explorer, Microsoft Graph Explorer. You're going to be presented this page, and this is really cool. It allows you to interact with the graph so that you can start to play with it and see what it's supposed to do. So I logged in, and it by default will say, hey, look, you've got an API endpoint, and you can say the verb that you want. In this case, I'm going to get, and I'm going to run query. And this is actually going out to Graph right now, and it's returning information on me. Pretty cool. Now, you could also do like a post request and say, hey, I would like to send a certain a body, a certain input, and I'd like to run it. Perfect. So let's go ahead and let's run the subscriptions endpoint. Did I spell right? I did. Subscriptions endpoint, I'm going to post because I'd like to add a new subscription, and I need to send along a body for it. So I've already got that here. Let's look at what this is saying here. This is saying that I want to create a subscription. The resource is anytime an email comes into my inbox, I would like to go ahead and be notified. Two things I need to add. One is I need to say, well, where? What notification is going to occur? Like where? What's the webhook? That is where our Azure function comes into play. I need to tell it the endpoint, the URL endpoint of my Azure function. So I'm going to go ahead and provide that in my resource. This is what will be notified. This is that webhook, that Azure function webhook I just created. And the last thing I need to do is I need to make sure that the expiration date is after now, but within 3 days, because the way subscriptions work in Azure is they only last for 3 days. So you want to go live with this tomorrow. Totally cool, totally understand. You're going to need to come up with a better interface to allow me to create a subscription to say, I would like to use this. It's okay that Graph has access to my mailbox. This application has access to the mailbox, and I want this subscription to occur. And in 3 days or X days, I'm gonna have to be notified to say, hey, do you basically want to renew the subscription or create a new one, because it only lasts for 3 days. So you really can't go and do this for everybody automatically. You can't just say, hey, I want this subscription to be for everyone. Every user would have to do it. You'd want to create some sort of interface. Now, when I go ahead and click Run Query, this is where it's most likely going to fail on me because of a timeout. What's happening right now is the Graph Explorer, the graph in particular, is sending a request to my notification URL. And it's sent it out to say, hey, I want to create a subscription. And the problem is the Azure function needed to reply within 10 seconds. And I have found the way I set it up with the minimal amount of resources possible, because I'm cheap and I don't want to spend a lot of money here, my Azure function is taking longer to spin up than that the first time. But once it runs once, it's typically quicker the second time. So let me go ahead and try to make that subscription again. And if it doesn't work, we'll give it a little more time to sort of spin up. Perfect, it worked. So I got a success code. And we can now see that I have a subscription. I have a subscription to that has been occurred, so that when my new messages come in, I'm going to be notified. All right. Something else I haven't showed you over in your Azure Functions is there is an ability here to monitor your Azure Functions so that you can see what's actually occurring. And there is one actual step I didn't show you. Those of you who know me, I'm really not someone who likes to lie. So you're gonna have to trust me on one thing. And I hate to have to say that, because I really wanted you to see that this is all totally cool. But what you can see on the monitoring side is I can see when my Azure function was triggered, and I can even see how long it took. You can see the first time it took 30 seconds to load up, and that was just too long. It needed to happen in 10, but the next time it took only 5 seconds, and we can even see what was outputted in my console log. So my application, my Azure function could actually register stuff to the console log, and then based on that, I can help use it to debug what's going on, what happened. And I can say, great, this went ahead and triggered. Okay, so everything should now be working. What I wanted to show you was in my untouched inbox, I have no email messages. What I need to now do is I need to go and send an email message to that email box. So that's my Overfield dev1, and I'm going to say this is a subject that I want to translate. And I don't need a body because it's not important right now. I'm going to go ahead and send that email message. Now let's go ahead and let's watch what happens here. If we're lucky, an email message will appear here shortly. And if it does, watch the subject if this all goes as planned. It should just load automatically. If it doesn't, let's just go ahead and load it, refresh it. And do I have my inbox? Do I have my email? My email message should be coming. It's frustrating when it doesn't want to show up. There we go. Ah, well, it already happened. What I was hoping to have happened was it wasn't going to be so quick. You would have actually seen that email message appear. The subject would have been in English. The Azure function would have gotten triggered, and my subject would have been translated. So for those of you French speakers, I think you'll find, I've been told, that this is an exact perfect translation. Think about what it took to get all that to work. And I did that in less than an hour, really less than like 30 minutes. I was able to reuse a little bit of code, but brand new from scratch, no servers. That was the applause line. So kind of fun, very, very fun, cool stuff. Now let's go back to our monitor, and you can see that the Azure function was just triggered. It was just triggered again, and this one was really quick. Now if we go into this, what we should find is, again, we've got some information, and in particular, we can see that a specific subscription was executed, and that subscription was the one that we just had. So it should be 9505. If we go here, we should see that exact same code right here. So that's the best way I can show that there really wasn't any smoke and mirrors. The subscription I just created to my brand new Azure function actually triggered properly, so that when you see that this email message came in and got translated, if I had done this 5 minutes prior, it wouldn't have gotten translated, which is pretty cool. So hopefully your heads are spinning a little bit and you're thinking, wow, that is some interesting stuff that you can do. So quickly can we create an Azure function from scratch. We can spin up a whole microservice without having to worry about any of that infrastructure. I didn't worry about operating system. I didn't worry about infrastructure. I don't worry about any kind of the backup stuff. I'm able to interact with graph data. I'm able to interact with my Office 365 data. I can subscribe to events, but that was just one example to subscribe. And I can even use other things like cognitive services. And all I needed to do was provide a little bit of a token to say, hey, yes, I'm actually, I'm using a valid subscription, and I can automatically leverage things like translation. So cool. So let's go ahead and finish up here in the last 3 minutes. If you want to get started and work with this stuff, really we were looking at two major things here. There's Azure Functions, which I showed you 0.1% of Azure Functions. There's so much you can do. In the Office 365, in particular SharePoint Online space, a lot of us are using Azure Functions, and the language we're using is actually PowerShell, and it's helping us automate our governance of SharePoint, site creation and site manipulation, all within Azure Functions and whatnot, which is really cool stuff. Microsoft Graph, you can learn more at graph.microsoft.io and what's all possible there. I've seen people who have been taking Azure Functions and they're using Azure Functions to interact with Graph for them. One of the problems with interacting with Graph directly in a SharePoint Online site is you need to have the browser go get a token for that user, and it creates a redirect, creates a flicker where they're being authenticated. And I have seen people basically wrap Microsoft Graph calls into an Azure function so that their SharePoint site in the browser is triggering an Azure function. The Azure function is maintaining the tokens to be able to go interact with the graph with somebody. So lots of really cool stuff that you can actually do with Azure Functions and the Microsoft Graph. I just did one small little piece. So with that, I believe that's really it. Just some shout outs as well. Next week, so this is the last week of November here that we're talking of 2007. Next week, I am in SharePoint Fest Chicago. I hope that if you're going, that you'll join me. I've got a couple sessions on TypeScript and automated site provisioning with SharePoint. I'm also doing a full day workshop as well on everything you'd want to know if you're a SharePoint developer. We're looking at really the patterns and practices, initiatives, the SharePoint dev ecosystem, so some really cool stuff. I really appreciate all you joining me. I know this is 200 levels, so you probably have a ton of questions you'd love to get in with the code. No problem, you can go get that code. I'll leave that URL at the bottom so that you can download it, full instructions on how to walk through this process, as well as we will have a video of this recording up shortly over at YouTube so that you can go through this video at your own pace and you can duplicate everything I just did. I didn't do anything special. There's no real magic going on there besides the putting some code in the right spot. So you should have no problems doing everything I did and then extending that. So again, I really appreciate everyone's time. I think we've got some Q&A that we can have. If there are no questions, I'm more than happy to say thank you all very much. Otherwise, how are we doing on questions?
Doing good. We've got one that came in about 15 minutes ago that I was waiting to get in there. We had someone ask, did you write this as plain JavaScript or did you use TypeScript and transpile?
No, it is pure JavaScript. It's the new ES 2015, so it's the newer JavaScript, shall we say. Basically, if you've ever done any Node applications, it's the newer versions of JavaScript. Browsers are slowly making their way to be able to have the more modern JavaScript techniques. But no, that's just JavaScript, no TypeScript at all. I know it looks like it, and it definitely does. TypeScript is kind of, I'm going off on a tangent. TypeScript was designed to give us modern for many reasons. One of the things it did is it gave us concepts that JavaScript is looking to include in the foreseeable future, but just couldn't yet. And most browsers, most legacy browsers definitely don't have the newer JavaScript compilers built in. But even modern browsers are still having problems with the later versions of JavaScript. But Node is basically what's running in the back end of Azure Functions, as far as I've been told. I don't actually know what's going on in the back end. And hey, I really don't care because I know I can just write in JavaScript. The server will compile it for me, will run it for me, and it will provide my responses, and it will store console logs, and it will do all that other cool stuff. And all I had to do is just provide valid JavaScript.
All right, well, there you go. I had a question, and I may be asking this in the wrong way, but hopefully you'll be able to understand. Bindings are a thing with Azure Functions as well, right? I can't. You may have touched on this a little bit, so if I missed that little part, I apologize. But I know there's a lot of different kind of bindings and whatnot with Azure Functions. Is there anything you can speak to about that? Is that important enough to what we're talking about now, or is that a whole other session in itself?
I would say it's a whole other session. Is there a specific aspect of that you're trying to talk about, or?
Oh no, just in doing doing a little bit of research on my own of Azure Functions and all that stuff. Just bindings was a theme that kept coming up, so I was just curious to hear a little bit more about it. But it did sound like it was a bigger topic, but I figured it was at least a worthwhile question to ask.
Yeah, that since I focus so much on one very small part of Azure Functions, I don't really want to spend another hour trying to go into cool examples of that. I don't have anything readily available.
That's fair.
There is so much you can do with Azure Functions. The key points that I like to think about, though, is an Azure function is something that typically is going to get triggered via a web page, a URL HTTP request. It might get triggered by a timer. That's pretty easy to set up. You don't have to worry about that. That Azure can help you set all that stuff up for you. But it's a small piece of code that is independent of the backend operating system, written in the language you want, and it can run a microservice for you. There isn't something I didn't really touch on at all with Azure Functions. Azure Functions need to be microprocesses. They need to be things that can finish quickly, and I believe the timeout is 5 minutes. It might be 3 minutes, it might be 10 minutes. I think it's 5 minutes. So basically, though, it has to be a quicker process. If it goes too long, it's just going to get shut down. If you need something that is a process that will run longer, like you want to go read and interpret maybe 1 million records of SQL database, you probably have to use a web job to do that. And Azure Functions not the right use case, won't be the right use case for that. But Azure Functions are significantly cheaper than a web job. So I like to think in our world, particularly in the SharePoint world, we're going to be using Azure Functions a lot for webhooks so that we can trigger them based on a web request, and we'd be using them a lot through like through a timer job, something that we want to have run continuously again and again and again.
Gotcha. And our dear sweet friend Ryan Scouten said the timeout is in fact 5 minutes.
Cool. Thank you. Good to know I was right. I thought it was, but some of these numbers aren't always going well in my head.
There you go. That's about it for our Q&A, right? Oh no, I lied. We have a couple come in, of course, right as I said that they all came in. So first one is, maybe unrelated, but does Azure Functions help with CORs? I am trying to consume a web service from a different domain.
They can. So what he's referring to is that it can be very difficult to, say you're loading a web page and you need to go get something from a service on a different domain. It can be really painful to get that. Yes, it can. And the reason why I say so is because your Azure function itself, once the Azure function loads, it's running in a sense in a context of a server. You can now have your Azure function go make another request. So it could go and do the cross-domain requests that you may need, and it comes back. So your Azure function is basically your own little mini API. You might wrap the API of whatever other service you're attempting to get to. I'm sure there are lots of use cases where that could be painful, but in general, yeah, you can use it to solve. Your Azure function would just be a wrapper to the external web service that you're trying to get to. You might have to worry about authentication, you might have to worry about token passing and other things, but I'm sure that's solvable.
Cool. And then our next question, do you have a guesstimate of cost to do this ongoing?
I think what you're referring to then is like, what's the actual cost to run the Azure function? Well, no, because Azure has a cost calculator. What I can say is everything I've done thus far that you've seen really hasn't even shown up on my bill. The Azure function itself, the cost is determined upon how many CPU cycles basically that you're running. So like how much is it actually running? I have not seen that I've gotten billed for the storage. So the code that I had to store, I'm not getting charged for. I'm only getting charged when I need to use my Azure function. And my functions are running so quickly, it really doesn't even register. They're counting your CPU cycles effectively is one way to think of it. Outrageously cheap. We're talking pennies here. Pennies. If your application is running thousands of times a day, I still think your cost is going to be not in the dollars and tens of dollars of range. It's going to be very cost effective. But there's a cost calculator. I think if you just type in Azure cost calculator, you can kind of learn more about how to determine those costs. It's significantly less than if you ran a VM for sure.
Gotcha. There you go. Well, that was, I'm going to say this, and we're going to see if more questions pop up. That was the end of our questions. Okay, nothing else popped up. So unless you've got something else you want to nerd out about, Eric, I think that's the end of our time for today.
Oh, there's Ramona asked.
Ramona's got a question. Did you mention?
Go ahead. Please read it.
Oh, did you mention the subscription lasts 3 days?
Kind of. What I mentioned was that when you create a subscription in the graph, in particular when you're subscribing to an email event, the subscription can only last for up to 3 days. So I had to provide a time, a last until. So actually, we can just go quickly look at that code. I needed to provide here a expiration date. And the expiration date must be within 3 days of now. It's actually 2 days, 23 hours or something. It's based on how many minutes or seconds. And I don't remember the actual, I've seen the math once and I went, yep, I'm not going to remember that again. I remember it's a little less than 3 days. So something to think about, like the example I showed, the subscription is based on a per user. So I didn't subscribe everybody in my dev domain to this. I subscribed me to it. So you would typically, I would think, if you wanted to do something like this in your organization, you would provide maybe something like on a SharePoint portal. You would create a link to go set all this up. And you might even have another Azure function which would go and trigger that graph request for you. So for me, so I would say, yeah, when I click on it, the Azure function would notice who I am, would store that, would go trigger the graph call. It would wrap up that post request to go create a subscription for me, and it would take that response, and it might have some error handling in case the subscription errored out. And I could even go like a step further, like I might want to store for my users who's subscribed to this, knowing when things are knowing when subscriptions will end, and that at the end of 3 days, I might have a timer job that every day goes and looks whose subscription is going to end today, and I would send them out an email saying, hey, your translation subscription is about to end. Did you want to renew it? And direct them back to the portal to do it. I'm not thrilled about the 3 days. That's just, it's a limitation. So
there you go. And go ahead, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, so Ramona followed up with, can it be automatically perpetuated?
That I don't fully know. My gut is no, and someone else may know. The reason why is because when you create that subscription, it needs to happen in the context of the user, and we need to know who that user is. You might be able to figure out a way to store a user context token so that you can truly interact for them through delegate permissions. But you've totally hit my limit on that. I have not done subscriptions to that level. It would sure be nice. I bet you could. I bet there's ways to figure a way to do that, but I don't know.
Got it. There you go. There you go. Well, I keep saying we're done, and then we're not done. So if anybody's got any other questions, again, I'll say this to Eric while if anything else comes in. Is there anything else you want to nerd out about this topic before we let people go?
No, not really. The only thing I can think of is if you're working as a SharePoint developer, you're going to find that a combination, I think, of Azure Functions and web jobs are going to be some of your go-to tools on interacting with SharePoint data. It's helping us solve the full trust solution gap that we now have with SharePoint Online. They are extremely useful. My gut would be go to Azure Functions first. They are less expensive, although to Bill's question, I can't tell exactly what the cost. I just know they are significantly less expensive, and that's what Microsoft keeps saying. And I would look at Azure Functions first, see if they can do it. The primary limitation factor might be a long-term process, something that lasts longer than 5 minutes. You would want to then move over into web jobs or into some other solution. But if you can do it in an Azure function, I sure would. I think we're going to see a lot more in Azure Functions coming out of the SharePoint dev ecosystem as well for helping us work with and maintain and administer SharePoint. So as SharePoint developers, SharePoint DevOps, as IT pros, I think that there's really some cool stuff. Interacting with SharePoint data and interacting with Office 365 data to make our solutions more powerful is going to be driven by the graph, absolutely. So I would recommend, if you have any interest in this, you download the code, you go read through the materials provided, you watch the video in a couple days when it comes out, and you get spun up what I just did. And feel comfortable with it. Do it a couple times. It's not hard. I made it take a long time by talking about it. By myself, I can do it in about 10, 15 minutes. I can copy everything over and move it all in place. Make sure you feel comfortable with that. And then as you're working with your organization, you're going to start finding solutions. You're going to start finding those problems that, like, wait a second, I've seen this. Like, I know how to do this. I've got the infrastructure idea in place, i.e. Azure Functions, Graph, whatever. Now I just need to write the code, and I can go write the code. And you've just saved yourself so much time, and it takes care of a lot of the arguments why you can't go to SharePoint Online, because you couldn't get the business logic, you couldn't get the business processes in place. Well, I'm pretty sure you can now. I would argue you can using what Azure provides for you, and I think your actual overall cost is going to go down. And you DevOps people, embrace this stuff. Don't fight it because you want to maintain that hardware. That's I think a losing out proposition. I think that accepting the new cloud world is going to help save your organization costs. That allows you to provide more value to your organization, but it still needs to be managed. Someone's going to have to take care of it within your organization. You be that person. And you help deliver business value by providing these processes, and you will find yourself, I think, significantly happier than you were before with an organization that definitely sees the extra value in you. They're not going to find a way to find a cost center there. There's cost savings by moving on. They'll want to keep you because you're saving them significant costs. Total tangent.
We love a good Eric Overfield tangent. Always informational. All right, y'all, we're going to wrap it up now. Thank you so much again for joining us. If you have any other questions, feel free to hit us up on Twitter at PixelMill or pixelmill.com. You can also find Eric on Twitter at Eric Overfield or also ericoverfield.com. We don't have a topic picked out for next month just yet. We're working on a couple exciting things, so we'll keep you all posted. Thank you so much again for joining us. Like Eric said, we'll be in Chicago next week for SharePoint Fest. Hope to see some of you there. And that's about all I've got. Thank you so much again for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you all. Talk to you all soon. Bye.